Religion has always fascinated me, at least in this sense. Every religion with which I am familiar regards itself as the one true religion. Yet the question that everyone asks is, how can God allow evil, such as slavery, children going hungry, police brutality, all of these things they want to blame on God? But today, brothers and sisters, we're going to talk about reparation for the black man. Many black people say it's not necessary. Many people say the United States of America can't afford to pay the black people back for what their forefathers have done. It may break the country. The bottom line is, every other nationality has gotten paid for the injustice that has happened to them. Look at the Jews. Those white Jews in Palestine are considered not to be the original Jews from the 12 tribes of Israel. And yet, they got paid when the Nazi put them in the Holocaust. The Indians in America got paid because they put them on reservations. So, it is time for us to demand retribution. The only reason why I say this is because America is not going to respect us anyway. And that's the only way we're going to get the same cushion. Donald Trump's father came to this country, illegally made money, and was able to leave his son billions. We came here, our forefathers built this country, and we're still poor. They bring people over from different countries and they give them grants to help them out. They open up stores. But again, this is the question I want you to ask yourself. If we had $1,000 apiece, how many of us would take that $1,000, put it together with 10 other people to try to build a business so that we could build our community? Because again, it's not about receiving the money, it's about what you're going to do with the money that's going to help build your community. Amen? Reparation. Reparation. The making of amends for a wrong one has done by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wrong. The court required a convicted offender to make financial reparation to his victims. 2. The action of repairing something. The old hole was pulled down to avoid the cost of reparation. We are entitled to reparation, brothers and sisters. Let's hear Martin Luther King talk about reparation, shall we?
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. This is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
That was Martin Luther King talking about reparation. Okay? That's a tricky question, and it was prompted by this reader. I want to chime in on the spat between Bernie Sanders and Ta-Nehisi Coates regarding Bernie's rejection of reparation. TNC deeply feels that the economic system America has today was deliberately built not just on the back of slaves, but also on the backs of African Americans who lived in the day of Jim Crow's laws. And even since the major civil rights victory of the 60s, I find it hard to disagree with this thesis based on the comprehensive evidence he marshaled in his landmark article making the case for reparation. Now we know this is the 20th century, 21st century, 2016. We know foreigners still come to this country and they're eligible to get free grants to build their empire, and yet the government has not allowed black Americans the same grants so that they could build empires. In fact, today, many black homeowners are having problems with the government. If you have 2 or more properties, they're trying to make you pay these extensive taxes to keep your property. You can't get subsidy. If you get HEAP or some kind of subsidy, they want you to be reimbursed the government with the money that they paid you, or they're taking your property. Again, we're finding racism in the government. Okay, so I want to continue with this article. Who else agreed with TNC that the United States economy was engineered for the benefit of rich white people at the expense of African Americans? A couple of years ago, TNC shared a video embedded above where Martin Luther King Jr. fearfully critiqued the government for rejecting grants of land to African Americans while officially opening up land in the Midwest to white farmers, funding land grant colleges for their education, and providing subsidies and other funding to prop up their farms. It's difficult to argue that Martin Luther King didn't believe African Americans deserved reparation, regardless of whether they were descendants of slaves. But Martin Luther King wasn't necessarily just in favor of race-based reparation. In his 1967 book, Where We Go From Here, Martin Luther King focused on poverty and explicitly argued against focusing on the plight of African Americans to the expense of others in poverty, which the government continuously do. Let's talk about Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is the story that we really want to hear about. Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street race riot.
Segregation boil over into numerous armed conflicts throughout the United States.
The Tulsa race riot of 1921, it really is set against a backdrop of multitude of race riots in America. 1919 was known as Red Summer because literally blood was flowing in the streets. There were over 25 major race riots in 1919 in America.
These riots occur in Minnesota, Nebraska, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere throughout the country. The worst riot during the summer of 1919 is in Chicago, which leaves 38 people dead and 1,000 black families homeless.
The important thing to remember about race riots during this period is that they are characterized by whites invading black communities. These are not black communities that are erupting. These are white citizens, sometimes aided by the police, who are en masse invading black communities, attacking black businesses, and attacking black homes.
In 1921, the fires of racial intolerance spread to Tulsa. The person who serves as the spark for Tulsa's riot is Dick Rowland. A 19-year-old black man, Rowland dropped out of Booker T. Washington High School so he could earn some money shining shoes in downtown Tulsa.
While some kids stayed in high school and went ahead and graduated, there was also a great desire by many others to go out and make some money. And you could make money in Tulsa. Even a boot black could shine an oil man's shoes and might get a tip of $1 or $5. That was incredible money in 1920, 1921. So to drop out of school was not all that unusual.
He worked downtown, and during that era, the era of the riot, 1921, there was really only one restroom that was readily accessible to African Americans. And it was on an upper floor of a downtown building called the Drexel Building.
The elevator operator at the Drexel Building is a young white woman named Sarah Page.
On the morning of May 30th, 1921, as he often did, Dick Rowland went into the Drexel Building, got onto the elevator to go and use the restroom. But something happened on the elevator. Not exactly sure what did, but what probably happened is that as he stepped onto the elevator, he tripped and fell into Sarah Page.
To this day, no one knows for certain what happened when those elevator doors closed. But what is known is that shortly after entering the elevator, Dick Rowland was seen running out, leaving behind a screaming Sarah Page. Tuesday, May 31st, 1921. One day after Dick Rowland allegedly assaults Sarah Page on an elevator in downtown Tulsa, the police arrest Rowland and take him to the jail on the top floor of the courthouse. The incident becomes the talk of Tulsa.
As the story went around that he had touched her, hit her, knocked her to the ground, and it escalated and became more inflammatory with each telling.
Ultimately, things just steamrolled, totally out of control. And a large player in all this was the Tulsa Tribune, one of the major papers in town. The Tulsa Tribune ran a story titled "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator."
This inflammatory article strongly implies that Dick Rowland, a black man, had raped the young white elevator operator, Sarah Page. 3:15 p.m. The newspaper hits the streets of Tulsa. Over the next 17 hours, the city will be consumed by a race riot on a scale never before seen in America.
By about 4 o'clock, you start to have a crowd of whites gathering in front of the courthouse, the downtown courthouse, where Dick Rowland was held. Over the next couple of hours, that crowd grows in size from 100 to 200 to 300 to 400 people.
8:20 p.m. Tulsa's Sheriff Willard McCullough orders a group of armed whites out of the courthouse. When his instructions for the crowd to disperse are ignored, McCullough takes precautions to protect Dick Rowland.
He guards all of the stairways leading up to the top floor of the jail. He also disconnects the elevator going on and posted armed guards up to where Dick Rowland was held.
9:15 p.m. False reports that the courthouse is being stormed by the white mob reach Greenwood, where the community is gathering to discuss what action they should take.
African American men in Tulsa decided that it was time to take a stand, that lynching a 19-year-old black man for an alleged assault was going too far.
Immediately, a group of armed African Americans, including World War I veterans, rushed to the courthouse and offered to help defend the jail. Assured by the sheriff that Roland would be safe, the men returned to Greenwood. The white mob, however, remains.
That might have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. After seeing this initial group of blacks, whites then started to arm themselves much more so than they had.
10:30 p.m. The white mob swells to about 2,000. Once again, word reaches Greenwood that a lynching is imminent. A group of armed blacks returns to the courthouse. Again, they are turned away.
But as they were walking back to their cars, a white came up to a black vet and said, "Where are you going with that gun, nigger?" And the black vet said, "I'm going to use it if I have to." And the white man said, "No, you ain't." A tussle started off, a shot was fired, and the race riot was on.
The situation in Tulsa quickly spirals out of control.
After those first shots were fired, at that point, the white rioters forgot about Dick Rowland entirely. And they were out to get all blacks for what they perceived as crimes against whites by blacks.
During the rest of the night, small excursions by whites into the district are repelled. But the residents of Greenwood will not be able to hold them off for long.
Once the sun was up and the mass invasion of Greenwood happened, whites would typically come in. They would be fighting gun battles with blacks who were defending their homes and businesses before being overwhelmed.
When the riot starts, many police officers abandon their duties. They side with the white rioters, deputizing many of them and detaining as many blacks as possible.
Black men were rounded up and taken to detention centers on the notion that that would be for their protection. But what that did was essentially to leave the black community defenseless.
We're taking you down, boy. We're taking you down.
Let's go.
Anybody who was white could arrest, detain, anything to anybody who was black and get by with it. And in fact, they were encouraged to do so.
I remember men taking my father to a place where they kept prisoners at 11th and Elgin, McNulty Park. Other than that, I never saw my father anymore during the race ride. I just remember my mother taking care of us.
The early morning hours of June 1st, 1921. With most members of the community in detention centers, their homes and businesses are looted and burned.
I will always remember 4 men coming in our house with torches, and my mother saw them coming, and she put the 4 of we children under the bed. And from under the bed, we could see them walking to the curtains and setting fire to the curtains to set our house on fire.
We start hearing shots, and my grandfather told us all to get up. And we got up, and we could see smoke and hear shots, and we couldn't sleep or anything. We were just frightened nearly to death.
The next 2-3 days, it was June, and school was going to be out. I was sitting up studying my lesson for an exam for the next day. And someone banged on that door, put that light out, but as soon as daylight came, we looked outside. All of these people were coming down this railroad track. Didn't nobody try to take a thing. And those people were coming along with track, they just had clothes on, that's all. Didn't try to take anything.
Once authorities in Tulsa realized that the city was really out of hand, a decision was made to go ahead and request the National Guard. So a telegram was sent to Governor Robertson, who authorized the Adjutant General to send the National Guard into the city.
9:15 a.m. 17 hours after the mob began to gather outside the courthouse, Oklahoma City units of the National Guard arrive in Tulsa. Martial law is declared at 11:29. The National Guard takes control of the city and puts an end to the violence, burning, and looting. The troops also round up the remaining African Americans and take them to internment centers. The white rioters are disarmed, but for the most part are simply sent home. Greenwood lay in ruin. Confusion lingers in the wake of the riot. Estimates on the death toll are uncertain, and uncounted numbers of blacks leave Tulsa, never to return.
The number of dead in the riot has historically been a subject of some controversy. The best evidence suggests that upwards of 300 people died in the riot.
I talked to the sexton at Oaklawn Cemetery, and he said the truckloads had been brought in and they were buried in the Pauper's Field in the southwest corner of Oaklawn.
Another disputed fact is whether airplanes were used to drop bombs on Greenwood during the riot.
I remember that they said an airplane was dropping kerosene on the houses from an airplane. I don't ever remember the airplane. I've had so many people say that I don't see how you couldn't remember years ago. But at 5 years old, I just didn't pay any attention to it.
The evidence is strong that airplanes were used in the riot. Some say that bombs were dropped. Others say that nitroglycerin was dropped to propel the fires that were going.
What is certain in the aftermath of the riot is that Greenwood has been permanently altered.
At that point, you had a city that was changed forever. Nearly 50 square blocks had been burned to the ground. Nearly a tenth of the population was held under armed guard at internment centers.
In less than 24 hours, a marauding white mob has transformed a black promised land into a smoldering wasteland. An estimated 300 dead, more than 6,000 blacks in internment centers, over 1,000 black homes and businesses decimated.
When we rode through Greenwood, I said we will never, 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 ever come back here. Thought we would never, ever come back. There was not a building standing.
After more than 17 hours of anarchy, the race riot is quelled and the flames of Tulsa are extinguished. But the scars would take much longer to heal.
The riot didn't really end when the martial law was declared and when the state troops came. There were reverberations that went on for many, many months, and in fact years after that.
The physical damage left in the wake of the rampaging white mob is immense, estimated at $5 million.
That $5 million that successful was lost in today's dollars, it would be in the billions.
The enormity of the devastation in Greenwood is staggering. This physical damage is matched by the impact of the riot on its residents. Despite not being accused of committing any crimes, most of the African Americans in Tulsa are locked up in internment centers, some held for days.
Ultimately, the economy of Tulsa began to come to a grinding halt because all these black men who were doing these so-called menial jobs were absent. And these jobs were necessary for the economy to move forward.
Faced with economic loss, white employers arrange for the release of the African Americans from the detention centers. But to gain their freedom, African Americans must wear specially issued tags signed by their employers.
Most folks, once they were released from the internment centers, came back, got busy, and got to work again rebuilding their community.
But rebuilding would not be easy in the face of the awesome destruction.
After the riot, because there was so much devastation in the Greenwood community, including a lot of homes, A lot of the victims of the riot literally lived in tent cities.
The Red Cross helps, spending at least $100,000 in its humanitarian relief efforts.
There is no doubt but the American Red Cross is the true angel of mercy during the Tulsa race riot and in the months that followed. The Red Cross provided food. The Red Cross provided tents and building materials to make platforms for tents. They found ways to provide medicine. They created a hospital in North Tulsa.
At the same time, the residents of Greenwood begin the long process of rebuilding. White Tulsa begins what will be an even longer process of coming to terms with its responsibilities for the riot. The white political and business leaders of Tulsa are embarrassed by the reality of what happened. The city establishes a reconstruction committee, which issues pronouncements of shame and makes pledges to rebuild Greenwood.
In point of fact, they did absolutely the opposite. And the most important event that they did, the most important action that the Reconstruction Commission did, was to try and steal the land where the black community had been, to use that as an industrial park or as the site of a new railroad station.
To accomplish this goal, a new fire ordinance is enacted mandating all construction meet tough new requirements. The additional costs of these requirements would make rebuilding Greenwood nearly impossible for its residents. Fortunately for them, a lawyer by the name of Buck C. Franklin is among those displaced by the riot.
B.C. Franklin, who's the father of noted historian Dr. John Hope Franklin of Duke University, was a lawyer here in Tulsa whose offices were destroyed in the riot. B.C. Franklin and his partners literally pitched a tent and set up their practice out of that tent.
Franklin had only moved to Tulsa a few months before the riot. But from his makeshift law office in a tent, Franklin and his partners mount a challenge to the validity of the fire ordinance. The Oklahoma Supreme Court strikes down the new ordinance, opening the way for the residents of Greenwood to rebuild. A week after the riot, a state grand jury is impaneled to investigate and charge those responsible for the atrocities.
The upshot of that is that the grand jury issued a sharply worded report that essentially said black people brought this on themselves. That was the bottom line. Given the era, the historical era, that is not a shocking or surprising result.
Although the grand jury files charges against various people, none of the cases is tried. Despite all of the killing, burning, and looting that transpired during the riot, no white person will ever be sent to prison. And the incident, the alleged rape that precipitated the riot, Dick Rowland's elevator encounter with Sarah Page would also never go to trial.
Sarah Page wouldn't testify against Dick Rowland, so Dick Rowland was exonerated from any charges of attempted rape or anything else that might have happened in the Drexel building. And not surprisingly, Dick Rowland left town.
And as it turns out, Dick Rowland was safe. But the community was destroyed.
Bolstered by the grand jury report laying the blame on African Americans, White Tulsa goes on as if nothing has happened. The African Americans of Tulsa are again segregated in Greenwood, left to rebuild on their own with no city assistance.
All the time when the city is trying to steal their land, black Tulsans are busy. They're building their homes out of packing crates. They're building their homes out of any sort of lumber that they can get.
But the rebuilding has to do with that spirit, the willing to succeed, the willing to reinvest. And it happened, and became bigger and better than ever. The story of Greenwood is not that there was a riot. The story of Greenwood is that there was resilience after the riot.
One of the great miracles is the rebuilding of Mount Zion Baptist Church, which had opened only 3 months before it was destroyed in the riot. All that is left is a $50,000 mortgage.
It was very difficult to rebuild.
built, but somehow they made a determination that the first obligation would be to pay off the old mortgage that they owed on the church.
It took a few decades, but ultimately they rebuilt the church and they paid off the mortgage.
The Tulsa race riot of 1921 devastates all of Greenwood, but it does not destroy the dreams or spirit of its residents. Though there is little help from outside, the district is reborn as a dynamic African-American community for a while.
Even though Greenwood rebuilt itself and really had another heyday in the 1930s and the 1940s, deep Greenwood, the commercial district, would not last. And there are different reasons for it. One, of course, is desegregation. And once black Tulsans were allowed to shop in other neighborhoods, they often did.
And once that captive market was dispersed into the broader market at large, they couldn't survive. They were not economies of scale that would permit them to achieve what they had when they had, a forced audience.
Then, in the 1960s, urban renewal efforts of the federal government contribute to the community's decline. Many of Greenwood's buildings are destroyed to make way for a new interstate highway that would run right through the middle of the district. Ironically, the government programs would inflict more permanent damage on Greenwood than the riot. For decades, the events of that night in 1921 were rarely, if ever, discussed in Tulsa.
There was what I would describe as a conspiracy of silence after the riot. The leadership here didn't really want to talk about it, and this went on for years and years and years.
I went all through school and never mentioned it. It was never in the history books or anything, and yet it was the biggest riot that we've ever had in America.
It was really a sort of a chilling period in Tulsa history to have such a major event, one of the most important events in the history of the city, be suppressed and something you didn't want to talk about.
Indeed, it seems as though some in Tulsa even tried to physically erase reports of the riot. One such record that no longer exists is an inflammatory editorial from the Tulsa Tribune, which some say helped ignite the riot.
No one can locate a copy of this, but it's an editorial that some of the riot survivors will tell you about that is entitled something to the effect, "To Lynch a Negro Tonight."
The reason we don't have that editorial is that sometime in the 1930s, somebody very carefully cut out that one editorial out of the bound volumes of the Tulsa Tribune. So when those volumes were later microfilmed, there was no copy of it.
But the story of the night Tulsa burned would not be suppressed forever.
If we're going to be able to look forward towards a better future, we have to look all this awful, scarred, depressing past square in the face. We can't be afraid of our history. We have to grapple with it. We have to understand how these things happen so we can prevent them in the future.
After more than 75 years, Tulsa and Oklahoma is officially ready to examine the question of what happened and why.
The Tulsa race riot of 1921 happened for a number of reasons, and that incident between Dick Rowland and Sarah Page was simply a spark. If that hadn't happened, something else would have happened.
Unlike the rest of Tulsa, African Americans never forgot the riot or the great promise and prosperity of Greenwood. Beginning in the 1970s, residents started planning the Greenwood Cultural Center. Built at a cost of more than $3 million, coming from the residents of Greenwood as well as city and state governments, the center was opened in 1989. The center serves as an archive on the history of the riot, but just as importantly, it celebrates the achievements and contributions of Tulsa's African American residents.
It's a good thing. It's a good beginning. It's a good start. We needed the cultural center. We need the cultural center to let us know that Tulsa is growing into a better city after all of these years.
In 1996, the 75th anniversary of the riot was marked with the dedication of a monument to Black Wall Street on the grounds of the Greenwood Cultural Center. Ceremonies were held at the nearby Mount Zion Baptist Church.
We had a great big celebration here, and there were many speakers, and Benjamin Hooks, the president of the NAACP, came in and spoke. Then we marched from here over to the Cultural Center, lit the flame for the memorial to Black Wall Street.
With these initial steps, Tulsa had begun to come to terms with the travesty of the race riot.
We can't change our history, no matter how negative it is. What we can do is take our history and learn from it and grow into the future.
Maybe if we talk about it enough, it'll never be again.
A decades-long effort to suppress the facts of the night that Tulsa burned nearly succeeded. But the survivors of that horrific event would not let this story be lost to history. The devastation of a vital community by a racist mob is not an easy past to confront, but one we must face if we are truly to go in search of history.
Yes, brothers and sisters, we know that history does repeat itself, and we are calling for reparation now.